let's begin your adventures in dreamland. Soft, surreal, and slightly cheeky sleep stories with awe and wonder. I'm Serene, your guide tonight. In a world of noise and endless options, you chose stillness with me. That means a lot. Dreamland floats across the world each night. Tell our community where we landed. And if you're vibing with Dreamland, a like and a subscribe tells the algorithm, hey, share the awe with others. And we know the world could use more wonder, more metaphysical, more of the unseen than the seen. We've forgotten we're spirit first, matter second. And if brushing your teeth didn't happen tonight, don't worry, you can still drift off with a clean conscience. Now, we return to what we are. Sleep isn't an escape. It's a temporary return, one we can't always access or remember. In the sleep state, the senses soften, the ego fades, and what remains is more of who you truly are. We forget our names, bodies, nationalities, possessions, and frailties. We unconsciously enjoy the great freedom that is native to the soul. Pure awareness, curiosity, and at the deepest fundamental level, in both physics and spirit, we are made of light, untouched by time, existing outside of it, free, a wave in the ocean of being. So let go. You are returning to your purest form. Freedom. Your story begins. The Pirate Code is episode 47 and part 3 of 4 in our Real Life Pirates mini-series, located inside our Dream Wonders playlist, where we marvel at life's fascinating facts. A shadow tips his hat at you. It's me, Captain Marlowe, back again. Last time, I steered you through the crooked havens on shore. But tonight, dreamer, we're back at sea, where freedom was loud, but order was louder. Come along. The deck is creaking. The lanterns are lit. And I have a story or two about how these rogues managed to keep from stabbing each other every 5 minutes. You think, all right, either I've nodded off after one too many Netflix binges, or I've woken up back on a pirate ship where the bathroom is a rope over the side. Not exactly 5-star accommodations. The ship rocks beneath your feet, steady but alive, like a beast breathing in the dark. After nights in noisy taverns, this is different. The endless sea stretching black and silver, stars pricked into the sky like nails in velvet. And yet, this wasn't chaos. Not if a pirate crew wanted to survive. A ship wasn't a tavern where you could brawl and forget the next day. Out here, a snapped mast or a mutiny meant death. That's why, for all their rum and rebellion, pirates built a surprising kind of order. Picture a deck at dawn, The crew stirs, hammocks swinging, mugs clattering. Duties are shouted: swab the deck, mend the rigging, check the powder. But underneath it all is an invisible law, a code that bound them tighter than chains. Without it, the black flag would have torn itself apart long before it scared kings. So before we get into the shouting, the voting, the duels at dawn, know this: piracy thrived not because it was lawless, but because it was governed by laws of its own making. 2. How did pirates govern themselves? It's a strange thought, isn't it? A ship full of cutthroats, thieves, deserters, runaways, running itself more democratically than the kingdoms chasing them. On land, kings ruled by birth, not merit. But at sea, pirates asked a sharper question: why should we trade one tyrant for another? They had bled under cruel captains in merchant navies, starved on rations, while officers feasted, been flogged for speaking out. Out here, under the Jolly Roger, they swore never again. So how did they govern themselves? By turning the deck into a parliament, the hold into a courtroom, the voyage into a contract between equals. Everyone had a voice, everyone had a share, and if a captain forgot that, well, the crew could show him the plank. This wasn't chaos. It was survival. They needed discipline, yes, but discipline chosen, not imposed. Pirate ships became floating experiments in freedom, stitched together from desperation, fairness, and the refusal to kneel. And so, dreamer, as the waves murmur around us, we step into one of the strangest truths of all. For a few fleeting decades, the wildest men alive lived by rules that would have shocked the kings who condemned them. 3. Pirate articles, written codes, every crew signed before a voyage. Here's the surprise, dreamer. Before pirates sailed, they didn't just sharpen cutlasses, they pulled out parchment. Pirate articles, a set of rules every man swore to before the voyage began. Imagine that, rogues who wouldn't wait in line on land, suddenly forming a queue to sign their names, or more often, mark an X. The articles spelled out everything: how loot would be shared, what punishments were due for theft or cowardice, how injuries would be compensated, and even rules for lights out. No gambling debts settled in blood, no stealing from a crewmate, no desertion in the middle of a fight. Some articles survive in full, like those of Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, which laid out 11 strict rules. They banned gambling on board, required candles to be out by 8, and even limited drinking so that men didn't waste away in drunkenness. Another set from John Phillips's crew in 1724 fined men for stealing from each other and required weapons to be kept clean and ready at all times. Anyone who broke them could lose more than their rum ration. These codes might sound stern, but they were also egalitarian for their age. Every man, from seasoned sailor to former slave, had a voice and a stake. In a world where most navies treated sailors as disposable, the pirate articles promised a measure of dignity and fairness. And here's the dreamlike twist. The articles weren't imposed by captains. They were agreed upon by all. Each man swore loyalty not to a person, but to the paper itself. It was a democracy written in ink and sweat, floating on the waves. Close your eyes and picture it. Rough sailors, hunched over a flickering lantern, the night heavy with salt air, their futures sealed with clumsy marks. No crowns, no kings, just a brotherhood bound by words scratched into paper that might outlast them all. 4. Voting and elections, choosing captains, quartermasters, and removing them if necessary. And once those rules were signed, the next step was bold: elections. Every pirate crew voted for its captain, the man who would lead in battle and negotiations. But unlike kings or admirals, a pirate captain ruled only so long as his men wanted him to. Imagine the scene. A restless crew gathered on deck, voices loud as gulls, casting their votes by shout, by hand, sometimes even by secret scrap of paper. One man's courage in battle, another's charm in taverns. These mattered more than noble birth or polished boots. But here's the kicker. Captains weren't untouchable. If they grew cruel, greedy, or unlucky, the crew could strip them of command with a simple vote. More than one captain went to bed with authority and woke up swabbing decks. The power of the ballot stretched further than just choosing a leader. Crews often voted on where to sail, which prizes to pursue, and how to divide provisions. In moments of dispute, a show of hands could settle the matter faster than a cutlass. This radical democracy shocked outsiders. Naval officers, used to unquestioned authority, scoffed at the idea of sailors debating strategy like a parliament at sea. Yet for pirates, it worked. Their lives depended on trust, and trust grew from knowing every man had a say. In many ways, their voting system foreshadowed democratic experiments that would come ashore decades later. Beside the captain stood the quartermaster, chosen by the crew as a counterbalance. He oversaw supplies, divided loot, and kept captains honest. Together, they formed a strange balance of power that most kingdoms on land couldn't imagine. It was messy, sure, shouts, arguments, sometimes fists, but it worked. A pirate ship was one of the few places in the 1700s where an ordinary sailor could vote a leader in or out. And isn't that a wonder? While kings on thrones scoffed, pirates at sea were busy testing the idea that power should answer to the people. The sea may have been cruel, but it carried a whisper of freedom the land had yet to catch. 5. Captain versus quartermaster. Balance of power. War leader versus daily leader. Here's where things get spicy, dreamer. On most ships, the captain was king, but on a pirate ship, the captain was more like a specialist. His main job was simple: war. In battle, his word was law. No debates, no votes. When cannonballs screamed and muskets flashed, a ship needed a single hand on the wheel. But the moment the guns fell silent, enter the quartermaster. He was the daily boss, the man who decided food rations, discipline, and where the next anchor might drop. If the captain was lightning, the quartermaster was steady thunder. And unlike kings, these two shared power in plain sight, always answerable to the crew. Sometimes it worked like a strange marriage, fiery, argumentative, but balanced. Other times, not so much. Quartermasters and captains clashed like rival gods, their disputes carried out in front of crews who weren't shy about choosing sides. A captain might roar commands in the heat of battle, but once the smoke cleared, the quartermaster took the helm of daily life. He controlled discipline, rationed food, and even mediated quarrels. Think of him as the crew's advocate, a man elected to keep the captain honest. Some quartermasters grew so powerful that they were nearly co-equal with captains. Edward Lowe's quartermaster, George Lowther, once overruled the captain's plans and was backed by the crew, proving that even feared leaders had limits. This balance of power kept ships from falling into tyranny, a safeguard that few navies of the age could claim. Picture it: a captain strutting, demanding more risk, more raids; a quartermaster folding his arms, growling about hungry bellies and torn sails. And there in the middle, a crew watching like an audience at a play, ready to decide the outcome with their votes. It wasn't always pretty, but it kept tyranny at bay. And in a world where most men had no say in their lives, that balance of power felt like treasure in itself. 6. Division of spoils, equal shares, extra cuts for injuries, surgeons, and shipwrights. Now, here's the part that made piracy truly gleam in desperate eyes: loot division. Unlike naval service, where admirals and officers gorged while sailors starved, pirates sliced treasure with surprising fairness. At the end of a raid, the quartermaster oversaw the spoils: piles of sugar, barrels of rum, cloth, spices, coins glinting like starlight. Each crew member received an equal share, no matter how rough their hands or low their berth. Historical records tell us just how these payouts looked. After capturing a prize, each man might walk away with several hundred pieces of 8, sometimes more than a year's naval wage earned in a single raid. Captains rarely took more than 2 shares, and quartermasters often just 1.5. A stark contrast to naval officers who hoarded wealth while common sailors scraped by. Compensation for injury was equally remarkable. A lost arm could earn 600 pieces of 8 or 6 slaves, depending on region, while a lost leg fetched slightly less. It was a crude but early form of workers' insurance, ensuring that men who risked life and limb would not be abandoned. Special skills earned bonuses. Surgeons for patching wounds, carpenters for keeping the ship afloat, musicians for keeping spirits alive. Even injuries came with compensation. Lose a right arm? That might mean 600 pieces of 8. Lose an eye? Fewer coins, but still enough to soften the blow. Strange, isn't it? Pirates had a proto-insurance policy, while most kingdoms gave their wounded beggars bowls. And imagine the scene. Men gathered on deck, the night lit by lanterns, silver and gold divided into little piles, laughter and curses flying. In that moment, each pirate knew the rules were real. Fairness wasn't a dream. It was tangible, glinting in their palms. For a brief shimmer in history, pirates made equality not a philosophy, but a payday. 7. Surprisingly, modern ideas, proto-democracy, workers' rights, and early insurance system. If you squint, dreamer, pirate ships start to look suspiciously modern. These were not just floating dens of thieves. They were laboratories of ideas that wouldn't show up on land for centuries. Think about it. Equal pay for equal risk, votes for leadership, health insurance for the injured, all in the early 1700s. Some historians argue that pirate codes were a floating laboratory of democracy. Long before revolutions shook Europe or the Americas, pirate crews were testing ideas of equality and collective bargaining at sea. Each man signed the articles knowingly, and each man had recourse if he felt cheated. Even the rotation of officers carried echoes of modern term limits. If a captain lost his crew's trust, a quick vote could strip him of command. In an age ruled by kings and empires, this practice was nothing short of radical. Though brutal in their methods, pirates may have been among the first to show that ordinary working men could run their own society. Meanwhile, on shore, kings ruled by divine right and workers scraped by on crumbs. Who was really ahead? Even the articles themselves were written contracts, signed agreements between workers and their bosses. Try explaining that to a nobleman who thought peasants were born only to bow. Pirates didn't just reject the crown, they mocked the very idea that anyone was born to rule. And it wasn't charity. These rules worked because they kept crews loyal. A sailor who knew he'd be fed, paid, and heard was far less likely to slit throats in the night. Fairness wasn't sentimental. It was practical survival. But still, There's wonder in it. Out on black water, under a ceiling of stars, desperate men stumbled into something resembling democracy. It wasn't perfect. It was brutal, fleeting, and soaked in blood, but it whispered of a future the world would one day chase in earnest. 8. Punishments, marooning, lashes, executions, and unique pirate justice. Of course, fairness came with teeth, break the code, and pirate justice was swift and often terrifying. The most infamous, marooning. A guilty man rode to a barren spit of sand, left with a pistol, a few shots of powder, maybe a bottle of water. Then the ship sailed away. Days later, he'd be bones in the sun, or, if luck favored him, a ghost story to scare other crews. Lesser crimes brought lashes. A cat-o'-nine-tails whip tore skin from backs until men screamed, scars branding them as warnings. Stealing from a crewmate? That could mean death outright. Betrayal? No second chances. Punishment was harsh, but it was also carefully staged. Trials were often conducted before the entire crew, ensuring that justice was seen as collective, not arbitrary. When a man was marooned, he was left with a pistol, a bottle of water, and perhaps a little food. A grim token of fairness, as though the sea itself were judge and jury. Some punishments also doubled as deterrents. Pirates caught cheating, the crew might have their ears or noses slit. A permanent reminder of betrayal. Yet, compared to navies where flogging could be endless and arbitrary, pirate justice was often viewed by sailors as stricter but fairer. At least you knew the rules before you broke them. Yet, pirate punishments weren't mindless cruelty. They were contracts enforced. The articles promised fairness, but only if everyone obeyed. Justice kept the ship together, as real as the ropes binding mast to deck. And in the strangest way, this justice carried its own surreal edge. Imagine a midnight trial on deck, lanterns swinging, waves black around you. The crew gathered like jurors. The guilty pleads. The quartermaster passes judgment. The sea waits silent for the outcome. No wigs, no robes, just survival in its rawest form. So yes, dreamer, pirate life shimmered with fairness, but it burned hot with punishment too. The black flag promised freedom, but never without cost. 9. Duels and settling disputes. Pistols at dawn, knives, or dice. Even under the articles, pirates argued loudly, and when shouts turned to snarls, there had to be a way to settle it without the whole crew tearing itself apart. Enter the duel. Sometimes it was pistols at dawn, 2 men facing off on the beach, sand cold under bare feet, flintlocks heavy in hand. Other times, it was knives, short and ugly, clashing in the cramped space of a deck. And then, in moments almost laughable, disputes were solved with dice. Imagine it, two cutthroats, red-faced with rage, reduced to shaking bone cubes in a cup, leaving their fate to chance. One recorded case describes two pirates settling a quarrel by standing back to back, pistols loaded, then walking a set number of paces before turning to fire. Both missed, but honor was satisfied, and the crew cheered the restraint. In other disputes, men rolled dice or drew lots, letting chance decide fate, a nod to the randomness of life at sea. These methods might seem reckless, but they had purpose. By staging conflict in ritualized ways, crews avoided brawls that could tear ships apart. Order wasn't maintained by suppressing anger, but by channeling it into contests everyone accepted as binding. The point wasn't always death. Many duels were fought to first blood, a scar to soothe pride and restore order. The crew wanted tempers cooled, not bodies piling up. After all, losing men meant losing hands on deck. Close your eyes, dreamer. Hear the crash of surf. Smell the gunpowder. Feel the tension as every sailor watches, breath held. In those moments, the sea itself seemed to pause, waiting to see if the quarrel ended in blood or laughter. 10. Superstitions. Whistling on deck. Women aboard and unlucky days. For all their bravado, pirates were deeply superstitious. Life at sea was too fragile not to be. Every shadow, every storm carried omens. Take whistling on deck. To a sailor, it wasn't a cheerful tune. It was an invitation for the wind to rise into a storm. Whistle too loud, and your mates might silence you quick. Women aboard were thought unlucky, stirring tempests or souring voyages. Yet paradoxically, women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read defied that very superstition, carving their names into history, proof that belief bowed to courage when the sea allowed it. Then there were unlucky days. Some crews refused to sail on Fridays, the day Christ was crucified. Others avoided stepping aboard with the left foot first, or cutting their hair on a voyage. Sailors also carried talismans to guard against bad luck. Some carved small wooden charms and kept them in their hammocks, while others tattooed anchors or stars on their arms as spiritual compasses. Certain days were so feared, like Friday the 13th, that some ships delayed sailing altogether rather than tempt fate. Even the sea itself was thought to be alive with omens. Dolphins swimming alongside were a blessing, while a sudden calm could be read as punishment for disobedience. In this blend of grit and superstition, pirates found meaning in chaos, a way to believe that fate could be bargained with. Even as cannonballs flew, superstitions stitched themselves into daily life. Charms tucked into pockets, tattoos inked as talismans, rituals muttered before raids. And isn't there a strange dream in that? Hardened men, faces scarred by battle, secretly terrified of a bird's cry or the wrong day of the week. Even the fiercest pirate could be undone not by a cannonball, but by the weight of his own belief in unseen forces. 11. Entertainment at sea, music, dice, storytelling, carving, tattoos. Life on a pirate ship wasn't all gunpowder and glory. Between raids, the days stretched long and dull, so the crew turned to entertainment. Music was their lifeline. Fiddles, drums, and pipes played on deck, while men clapped, stomped, or sang bawdy shanties that could make even the sea blush. Sometimes the rhythm was rough, but it kept spirits from sinking lower than the hull. Then there were dice games, cups rattling, coins clinking, laughter and curses rolling across the deck. A man might lose his month's share in an afternoon, only to win it back before dusk. And yes, sometimes knives flashed when luck soured, but often the games were just a way to pass another endless stretch of blue horizon. Pirates also carved, scrimshaw etched into bone or ivory, wooden trinkets shaped from scraps, charms to wear or trade, and tattoos, crude, painful, permanent, anchors, skulls, mermaids, marks of belonging inked deep into skin. Imagine a man baring his chest, the sting of the needle reminding him of who he was, free, if only for now, and storytelling. Oh, the stories. Around lanterns at night, voices wove tales of sea monsters, ghost ships, and treasures buried so deep no tide could touch them. Truth blurred with fantasy until even the teller forgot the line. On calmer nights, the crackle of a fiddle or the beat of a hand drum might drift across the deck, turning the ship into a floating tavern. If no instruments could be found, pirates improvised. Musket balls rolled like dice, boots stamping to keep time, laughter carrying over the waves. Storytelling, too, became a kind of currency. Crews passed along tales of other captains and their exploits, half gossip, half history, each retelling polishing reputations until they gleamed brighter than gold. In this way, even in the endless stretch of sea, news and myth traveled faster than the wind. Dreamer, picture yourself swaying in that circle of light, listening to the laughter and lies. For a moment, the sea feels less empty, stitched together by sound, myth, and memory. 12. Sleep in routines, hammocks, watches, nighttime shifts, storms. When the games ended, pirates sought rest in hammocks. Rows of canvas slings rocked with the ship, bodies swaying in rhythm with the tide. Privacy was none. Comfort was little, but exhaustion made even rough sleep feel like treasure. The crew worked in watches. Half the men slept, while the other half stood guard, trimmed sails, or scanned for sails on the horizon. Nighttime was quieter, but never still. The creak of rigging, the slap of waves, the mutter of men keeping ships alive. Storms shattered any routine. Thunder roared, rain slashed, and men scrambled in darkness to save the ship. Sleep vanished. Fear took its place. Yet even then, discipline held, each man clinging to his task, trusting the articles and each other to see dawn again. Pirates rarely enjoyed deep sleep. They rested in shifts, swinging in their hammocks with one ear tuned to the sea, always ready for the sudden cry of sail ho or the lurch of a storm. Hammocks were more than bedding. They were safety nets, keeping men from being flung across the deck when the ship pitched. Some night watches passed the time with quiet whistles or coded songs, small sounds to assure one another that all was well in the dark. Even in rest, the rhythm of pirate life was restless, a life lived half in waking, half in watchful dreaming. For you, dreamer, imagine swaying in a hammock, the smell of tar and salt heavy in the air. Lantern light flickers, shadows stretch. Outside, waves murmur like lullabies. Danger waits beyond the horizon. But for now, you float in the fragile peace of a ship at rest. 13. Storm survival, routines, fear, praying versus sailor pragmatism. When storms rose, all codes, games, and songs fell silent. Nothing tested a crew like the sea in fury. The sky blackened, waves climbed mountains, and lightning cracked open the heavens. Men raced to reef sails, hands burning on wet rope, voices swallowed by the roar of wind. Buckets flew, cannons were lashed tight, and every man prayed the timbers would hold. Some clung to faith, muttering prayers, clutching talismans, bargaining with saints they'd long ignored. Others spat into the wind, cursed the storm, and trusted only their skill with ropes and sails. Both kinds knew fear. Some storms were survived not by strength, but by ritual. Crews lashed themselves to the rigging, faces stung raw by salt spray, while others clutched small charms, a coin rubbed smooth, a scrap of cloth from home, believing such tokens could steady the ship as much as ropes and sails. In the howling dark, even the fiercest pirate might whisper a prayer, not to kings or churches, but to the sea itself, begging it to show mercy. And when dawn came, those still alive often said the same thing. It felt as though the storm had chosen who belonged to the waves and who would be spared to see the horizon once more. The storm was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, brave or coward, all were small against it. And when the fury passed, the survivors staggered onto deck like ghosts, salt-streaked, trembling, grateful for another dawn. Dreamer, imagine lying in your hammock as the ship heaves, rain hammering above, every creak a question. Will the mast hold? Will we last the night? It was terror, yes, but also awe. For in the heart of a storm, pirates touched the raw power of the sea and knew how fragile freedom truly was. 14. Reflections on governance. Pirates as rebels, rejecting kings and empires. And yet, between storms and battles, pirates built something remarkable. They were thieves, yes, but also rebels. Men who looked at kings and said, "No more." To men ground down by empire, the pirate ship became a floating republic. Here, a runaway slave could vote alongside a seasoned gunner, and a poor fisherman's son could overrule a captain. It was messy, imperfect, and often brutal, but it was theirs. Historians sometimes call this the other Atlantic democracy, a fleeting glimpse of equality rising in the cracks of empire. For a generation of outcasts, the code was more than law. It was proof that a ship of rogues could live without kings, if only for a moment, before the world closed in again. While empires claim divine right, pirates claim the right of choice. They rejected crowns, coats of arms, and the notion that one man's birth made him better than another. Their articles were proof: equality by vote, justice by contract, power checked and shared. It wasn't perfect. Brutality and greed stalked every deck. But the experiment mattered. For a handful of years, and 1,000 creaking hammocks, and a dozen battered sloops, men who had nothing built, a world where their voices counted. And maybe that's why their memory lingers, not just because of gold and blood, but because, against all odds, they carved out a fleeting democracy in the teeth of tyranny. Dreamer, as you drift with the tide of thought, consider this. Perhaps the black flag frightened kings not only because of what pirates stole, but because of what they represented. A world where ordinary men ruled themselves, even if only until the next storm. 15. Echo in pop imagination. Why people still romanticize pirates as symbols of freedom. Even now, centuries later, the echo of pirate democracy rattles in our bones. We dress them up in books, splash them across films, sing their songs in taverns they never walked. Why? Because pirates became symbols of freedom. Not the tidy, polished kind, but the rough, gritty freedom of men who chose their own leaders, split their own spoils, and lived by rules they themselves had written. A kind of justice too raw for marble halls, but strangely more honest. Of course, myths softened the blood and hardship, the hunger, the disease, the scars from whips. Those fade in the retelling. What lingers instead are the things we crave: adventure, equality, brotherhood, and defiance. The pirate became a canvas, half truth, half dream, painted over and over until they were no longer criminals, but legends. And maybe, dreamer, that's why we still smile at the skull and crossbones. Not because we envy their lives, but because we envy their audacity. They were outlaws, yes, but also reminders that the world doesn't always have to be the way kings and empires demand. And now, the lanterns dim, the articles are tucked away, the deck falls silent, and the sea rocks us like a cradle. We've seen pirates not just as cutthroats, but as lawmakers of their own strange world, a fleeting democracy carved into wood and parchment, lived out on the rolling deep. But don't think the story ends here. Piracy didn't vanish with the last gallows in Port Royal. It twisted, shifted, and still sails in surprising forms today. Container ships off Somalia, smugglers in the South China Sea, echoes of the black flag flying in the modern age. Next time, we'll chart that persistence. How piracy never truly died, but adapted, a shadow always lurking where law meets ocean. For now, dreamer, rest easy. Your bed rocks like a hammock, the night hums like the sea. Close your eyes. The storm has passed, the articles are signed, and you are safe on calm waters. Sleep takes the watch now, steady as any quartermaster. Good night.